Good morning. So, let's talk a little bit about something that you, regardless of whether or not you're like, unless you're a complete hobby programmer and you're never going to like do anything like a professional thing, or you don't really enjoy, like you enjoy playing around a little bit with coding, but you're not going to get serious about it. Like this is a topic that is near and dear to every programmer's heart, and it's called refactoring. Yes, let's talk about refactoring. So, what is refactoring? Well, refactoring is basically what happens when you come to a piece of code that you personally think is really messy or really ugly or hard to understand or something like that, and you have the brilliant idea of saying, hey, you know what? I don't like how this works or how it looks, and so I'm going to rewrite this in a way that is understandable and comprehensible to me. Now, there are a few things to consider when you're going to do this, and in my experience, when you are a fairly young programmer, like you're just beginning, your initial approach to this is going to be that, oh, I hit this problem, or I wrote some code, I thought I was going to solve it in one way, and then you hit a dead end. This used to be my biggest fear, and to some degree it still is, that you're going, like, you have a fairly big problem and you're not, because it's usually the case. It's very rare that you know exactly how things are going to end every time you build something. So you start writing code and you're trying to solve the problem from one direction, and then you realize that after investing a lot of time that, hey, this is not going to work. And your initial instinct is usually, I'm going to rewrite this, or I'm going to start from scratch. The problem is that luxury, you really only have that luxury when you are either on a very small project, or when you have an enormous amount of time and investment from your boss or the company that you're working for. Because, like, imagine Facebook. Think of, like, if they want to rewrite one of their applications, which is for the most part thousands, if not millions. I guess same thing at Ticketmaster. I mean, the code base is massive. You cannot rewrite that in a reasonable amount of time without some serious investment from people in the company. Like, I mean, it's just too much. Like, no one program, I mean, we're talking thousands if not millions of lines of code, and you want to rewrite that into something nice and usable. And then let's talk about the fact that every time you refactor something, it poses a risk to the project, because even if you're like one of the best programmers in the world, the statistics are saying that for every change you make, especially to older code, odds are that you're going to break it. So some programmers have adopted the mentality that, you know, if it works, don't change it. I argue, however, that even though this is correct, it's something that mentality is very, very dangerous, because these are usually also the programmers who who write the ugliest code. Like, I'm sorry, but like, I have this debate with an old boss of mine where he said, you know, Frederick, you know, Volvo and Saab, and like I've heard about, you know, they write programs that have been running for 20 years and they've never changed them ever. And I said, yeah, that's great, but you see what you said there? If you are 100% sure that code that you wrote is never going to change, and you can never be, I argue, like, everybody who says, oh, it's never changed, I'm like, over and over. Same thing at my old job. My absolute favorite colleague, Mark, had said this 100 times. Well, Frederick, why are you trying to refactor this and make it comprehensible and all that stuff? And I said, because I don't, like, it's not maintainable. We can't maintain it in an effective way. Like, I can't do my job when things are this way. And he said, oh, well, I think it's a waste, you know, you shouldn't be doing that, because, you know, it's very, like, we never touch this code anyway. And I'm kind of like, well, for the past 2 years, we pretty much touched this code like several times over. You see, because what happens is that this is a concept I've been talking about previously, and it's it's basically the broken window principle, or like when a ugly piece of code grows too big, your initial way of dealing with it is not to like fix it, because fixing it is very costly and it poses a risk to you and your job, because there is like, you should know this, that like this, and it shouldn't be this way, but this is the way it is in general. If when you're working on a programming team, if you broke it, you own it. That's usually the way that things work. So if you never break anything, it's very like you can avoid having to take ownership of the problem. So refactoring for anybody is a bit of a risk. Now, refactoring in a typed language, such as Java or C# or something, is usually safer. But most people are really, really scared about refactoring things in JavaScript, with good reason, because in a loosely typed language, odds are that you're going to miss a variable, or you're going to miss an input or something, because you don't have a compiler. So you're like, these really like basically programmer errors are very likely to appear in your code, so it poses even greater risk, which brings us into the importance of linters and static analysis and like testing and all that good stuff. So these things are important. But now like the refactor question is an interesting question, because like, when do you know that when should you refactor something? And what I like to think about, or like the strategies for refactoring something, it's actually very simple. The problem with the approach I mentioned earlier, where like you rewrite everything, or it's called the big rewrite, is that it never turns out the way you think it will. And the reason why is because when you come to the problem, you are not in a position where you can understand every aspect of how these, like the decisions that were made that brought the code to the place it is today. It's the thing that Ticketmaster is the same thing. Like, the system is butt ugly. Like, it's one of the most horrible systems I've ever worked with. And I can stand here and say, like, as somebody who's been working there just a few years, saying that, we need to rewrite this in a modern way and like do all these things. And the more I work with it, the more I realize that, the reason why it looks the way it does is because the requirements are what they are. I mean, I'm thinking of things in the perspective, how do I make a really nice application? But that's not how it works. You see, your stakeholders and the people who are paying you to build this want things in a certain way. And the way that they want things to be affects your ability to write effective code. I mean, wouldn't it be great if everybody was an engineer and all we cared about was to make really nice applications and well-structured code? That would be great, right? But that's not the reality. So that means that when I start with the big rewrite, what's going to happen is that I'm going to improve, in general, the places where the code that made me feel that I needed a big rewrite, and I'm going to cause issues in other places. You see my mentality, like, because you don't, like, a code base grows over years and years and years. And if you think that you're going to sit there and just rewrite everything in one sitting and make everything perfect, you are fooling yourself. And don't worry about it, because everybody does it. Like, it takes a few years of pain and misery to realize that it's not a viable strategy. Finally, I'll give you what I think is the approach you should be using. And the approach I think you should be using is the iterative process. So if you decide that, hey, there's some ugly code here, I want to rewrite that, I suggest that you do something very similar to what I did for Ticketmaster. You realize that the problem is like that the big rewrite is not going to work, and you instead of rewriting everything, you take the approach of doing it as you go along. So what that means is that you put in place linters that will encourage, like we wanted to transfer over from ES5 to ES6, for example. And I said, like, to my colleague, we can't just sit down and do that all in one sitting. We could create like an automated way of doing that, but I think that the most healthy way of doing it is to put static analysis tools such as linters that simply tell you that when you're working on the file, warn the programmer of saying, and tell him, like, convert this over, you should be using ES6 instead of ES5. So that everything from one point to another is transferred into what we call, like you're transitioning the code base as you go along. Because what's good about that is basically that you're in situation, you're how do I put this? When a programmer is touching a certain piece of code, that's most likely the point in time where he or she knows the most about that piece of code, which means that any like changes or refactoring you want to make are more likely to work. Because if you're just coming in there to refactor things, you don't have as much understanding of the code that you're changing, which increases the likelihood of you creating a bug or not understanding or making what we call a regression bug. And a regression bug is in essence that something worked one way and then you change something and now it doesn't work anymore. So that's the way I think you should approach refactoring problems. So think of it as instead of, let's say you have a big party of people, you're letting a bunch of people into your party and everybody's having a good time, and then all of a sudden you say, hey, you know what, I'm gonna bump up the average age of everybody inside. What do? Do you send in your bouncers or whatever into the party and like start to pull the people out without even ask them and do all that stuff? No, that's not a sane way of doing it. What you do is that you say to the people who are letting people in, like the bodyguards or the bouncers at the entrance, hey, the age group just bumped up. Don't let anybody in that is younger than this age. Because what's going to happen is that the people who are already inside are going to start coming out sooner or later. And if the only thing that's coming into the party are the people you're looking for, over time you're going to solve the problem. And you should think the same way about your code.